Greetings, one and all. This is Adam Tucker with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, welcoming one and all to our Networks for School Improvement webinar. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Vivian Mahalikas. Vivian?
Hi, everyone.
And we have the delight and pleasure of representing our team in sharing our learnings from the RFI and talking a bit about our RFP. We're super excited to spend the next hour with you to talk you through what we learned through the RFI and to give you some context and information about the RFP. And a couple of things to kind of set up this conversation. Despite the fact that there's close to 1,200 folks participating in the webinar, in our heads, Vivi and I are thinking of this as like an informal conversation among friends, talking about what we think is very exciting and important work on behalf of so many young people in our nation who need and want a better education. And so despite the kind of formality and the slides and the presentation, we really do see this as a conversation among friends who really want to do important work that means great outcomes for more kids. So what I'm going to do is actually just go to the next slide so you all can see how we hope to spend the next hour. Broadly, we're kind of focused on two things today. And the goal really is for you to leave having a sense of what we learned through the RFI process. Many of you shared generously lots of your thoughts, lots of your work through the RFI process, and we learned many, many things, and we want to share that with you. And we committed to getting back to you, so this is part of that, that commitment to you. And then secondly, we want to begin to answer your questions about the RFP. Many of you have already begun to submit RFP questions through the portal, and so we want to take part of this session to make sure that we begin to answer some of those questions today. So again, we'll probably use the first 20 or 30 minutes or so to kind of walk you through the RFI, and then we'll move on to the questions that you have already submitted. We also want you to know that through the webinar and through the portal, you can actually post your questions. So we also want folks to, as you're listening to the webinar and sort of the information that we're sharing, we want you to use the platform to submit your questions. You can use the chat bar or the Q&A option, both of which are on the right-hand side of the screen. We actually prefer that you use the Q&A button for the questions. However, the reason for that is it allows us to capture and document the questions, and so that we can republish them in our frequently asked questions section of the website. So again, we know this is a big sort of a big webinar, but please do feel free to use the Q&A button on the platform to post your questions, and we'll do our best to respond to those questions in real time. So that's really it for our agenda today. So before we kind of get into this slide, I just actually want to ground us in the work of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation K-12 team and our K-12 strategy. And I sort of am assuming that folks know this, but I think it's worth saying and restating. Our mission as a K-12 team is to improve outcomes, particularly high school graduation and persistence through the first year of college, for Black, Latino, and low-income students, because we all know the data. The data show that those students face persistent achievement gaps that are deep and unwavering. And given our commitment to equity, given our belief that all lives have equal
matter.
Thank you, Vivian. This is our strategy and our work, and that's where we're focused. And so with that as the backdrop, we also want to say that we come to this work and we came to the RFI process with humility and respect for all of you who are part of this webinar and who responded to the RFI. It is not lost on us that we are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with tremendous resources, with tremendous reach and tremendous opportunity. And we really hope and expect to make a difference in the world. But we also know that it is through our partners like you all on the phone and on this webinar who do this work. And so we come to this, and we came to the RFI process with a real humility and a real respect for the work that you do. And we hope that you can see and feel that through the RFI and the RFP process. And if it doesn't come through, you need to let us know, because it's really something that is important to us. Again, while we sit in a very privileged seat, to be perfectly frank, we know that this work cannot happen, and the changes that we hope to see will not happen without partners like you. So we put out the RFP because while we have a strategy and while we have a point of view about things that we can do to move the needle and improve outcome for kids, we also know that there's a lot that we don't know. And so we wanted to issue the RFP, which went out last fall and was open from the RFI, which was open last fall, open between October and November, with a real goal of trying to hear from intermediaries who were aspiring, who were experienced, and to really get a sense of the kind of work that you were doing already or intended to do in and around this work. And I will say that the RFI absolutely delivered on what we had hoped. We learned a tremendous amount. And it also helped us learn from folks who we did not know. One of the reasons we have moved in this direction with an RFI and an RFP process is that we are very eager and anxious to learn from and develop partnerships with folks we don't know, folks we have not previously funded. And part of this RFI and RFP process is allowing us to do that. And we also issued an RFP because it felt like a bit of priming of the pump, right? That it was beginning to communicate to the field our strategy, some of our intentions and interests, and we also were thinking that the RFI could help folks when it actually comes to the eventual RFP. So a few things we want to share with you, and I won't read all the detail on this slide, but we wanted to give you all a sense of actually who responded to the RFI. I will say that I'm a longtime person on the K-12 team. I'm now in my 13th year at the foundation, and this kind of open RFI and open RFP for such a broad anchor part of our strategy is something that we've never done before. So frankly, we weren't sure how many folks were going to respond to the RFI, and we were pretty pleased with having 278 complete responses, and you can see we had lots more logins and lots more folks got started. A particular note to us was that 60% of the folks who responded were folks who actually had no previous funding relationship with the foundation. That was something that I would say is pretty exciting to us and was actually something that we were really seeking to achieve. Vivian is going to sort of walk us through a bunch of the things that we learned through the RFI. And before she does that, the one thing I will say that the RFI did for us broadly is that in your responses, I think you affirmed for us that the notion of working with intermediaries to run networks of schools using continuous improvement to move on specific indicators and outcomes that we know are predictive of high school graduation and success in the first year of post-secondary is that we're on the right track, that strategy clearly resonated in the field, and not simply because we asked you. Like, we're smart enough to understand that dynamic. We know it resonated because the substance of your responses were real, they were meaningful, and they taught us something. So, and frankly, we felt pretty good about our strategy, but it was created amongst our team, and this engagement with the field has been incredibly helpful. So as Vivian walks you through some of the things that we learned, also know that a more detailed memo around our RFI learnings will be published and issued next week. So please return back to the website so you can read this in greater detail. Right now, we want to sort of give you the highlights and the big broad takeaways for the time being. Vivian.
Great. So as Adam said, in the next several slides, we'll explain some of the big things that we learned about continuous improvement work and about improvement networks that are happening around the country. And we picked specific things to talk about just because we thought that they were things that were important as people think about whether they want to respond to the RFP and how they want to respond to the RFP. So the first thing about what we learned about continuous improvement work that's happening around the country, so the major headline is probably not all that surprising, and it's this: in order for continuous improvement efforts to succeed, they must be relevant and valuable to those engaging in the work. So many of the respondents spoke about the need to ensure that the work is grounded in the specific needs of their students, that it's relevant and related to the school goals, that the work is really practical and not like overly technical and theoretical, that you really like get down to work right away, and that the work is valued by the school leadership and resourced appropriately. So people have to have the time to do the work. So in other words, we heard really loud and clear that continuous improvement work can't feel like an add-on or just one more thing to do. We also learned that continuous improvement takes many different forms and can be interpreted in really different ways. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see the most commonly cited continuous improvement models. Of the 278 responses, 87 unique models were cited. And as you can see, we received like a mix of organization, of improvement models, and in some cases, models like communities of practice that don't necessarily fit into the category of continuous improvement. Also, in some cases, people had interpreted continuous improvement as sort of like a broad notion of trying to get better all the time and continually improve. One more thing I do want to say about the models is, we learned that as I said, continuous improvement sort of takes many forms and can be interpreted in many ways. And this is a lot of the work that's going on around the country. We can't say whether these models are being implemented with fidelity, but we just know that they're very familiar to the field. Because of the wide variability in how people understand continuous improvement, we've included in the RFP what we really hope, fingers crossed, will be a clear definition of continuous improvement. And we came up with that definition based on the RFI responses and based on the research and theory in the field of improvement science, where our definition of continuous improvement is anchored. So I really encourage you to reference the glossary to see how we are in understanding and interpreting continuous improvement, and by extension, what we're excited about funding. So the next slide, moving on to networks. So there are a range of ways that networks can form. We learned that through the RFI responses. And with all that we learned from the RFI responses and from the literature on network formation, we really can't say that one way of forming is better than another way. We can say, though, that some ways are much more prevalent in others, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the most common ways are the ones that get the best results for students, particularly Black, Latino, and low-income students. Several intermediaries reported that forming a network is easier and more efficient when they worked with the set of schools or had some previous connection with them. That said, we also heard that there are downsides and difficulties when communities that have formed for very different reasons, like, for example, sharing learning on a specific topic like high school math, when those communities try to shift to very different type of network, a network that has a common and specific aim and a shared theory of how to reach that aim. For example, like a network that goes from just sharing on a topic like high school math to really committing to action to increasing the number of Latino students who are enrolled in Algebra 1 in 8th grade. So in other words, we learned it isn't easy to shift from one network to another network. So we'd recommend really thinking carefully how you bring schools together and how you determine that those schools are likely to work collectively, learn more, and move faster together. That seems to be like a really critical factor in the network success. Another thing we learned is that school teams, principals and teacher leaders must really want to participate in an improvement network. Continuous improvement, as we all know, isn't easy, so making sure that schools want to be part of the work is really critical. Having a shared understanding of the problem, particularly how it manifests itself in their school context. Looking at the data to understand what the root causes of that problem are, what's likely causing the problem. And then finally, and probably most importantly, teacher leaders and school leaders really need to have the will and ambition to want to solve the problem and the resources to do so. The very last thing on this is a look at the numbers. So few intermediaries reported working with more than 20 schools. There were some that worked with larger numbers, but most were in the range of about 10 to 20 schools.
Can I add one thing? Just
You
because
may.
there's not a bullet that speaks to this, but one of the things that we've been talking a fair amount about on our team is really hoping to understand how intermediary partners think about leveraging what I will just call the power of the network, right? We believe, and we believe that you believe, there is a reason to bring schools together, right? That there is something about the power of the network that can advance this idea and to have better outcomes for kids. And so as you were thinking about possibly responding to the RFP and how you were thinking about forming your network, one of the things that we will be looking for and thinking about is the ways in which you are leveraging what I will just simply call the power of the network, which is very different than working with a school individually or in a singular fashion.
Or even working as part of a community of practice where you're sort of just sharing ideas.
Exactly.
It's about like collective action towards, leading us to the next slide, a specific aim.
Right.
So and this is sort of the final of the technical things we learned is about aim statements. So like continuous improvement, we were pretty loose on the definition of an aim in the RFI. And we found that many organizations that responded to the RFI really struggled with aim statements in terms of how big or small they should be, or how they should be created, or what's the right data to look at to determine the aim, or even the variety of data that you might look at to come up with an aim. I say this because it really surfaced two things for us. One is we need to be clear about what we mean by an aim, and so you'll see a definition of aim on this slide and in the RFP glossary. That's another plug for the RFP glossary. So we see the AIM statement focuses the network's improvement efforts and provides a specific, measurable, and time-bound goal for the network's collective action related to improving outcomes for Black, Latino, and low-income students. The other thing is we think that this is an area where we as a foundation can provide support for intermediaries. So even experienced RFI respondents, we're asking help in this area. So when you respond to the RFP, don't be shy about saying places where you really do think that you need more support, because that's something that we're committed to doing, is providing support for the field in places where they feel that they need it. On this slide, you'll see a few bullets about what we learned about how intermediaries set aims with networks of schools. I'm not going to read all of these, but they sort of fall into two categories. The one is intermediaries work with schools to study multiple and various pieces of data. They come up with a network aim and then school level targets that track to that aim. So starting with the schools and working up. One of the other big ways is that intermediaries look at the data around a specific and known problem. So for example, the scarcity of Black males in advanced placement courses. And they, as an intermediary, set the aim and invite schools that are committed to that aim to join the network and participate in collective action to reach that aim. We didn't find any relationship between how the intermediaries set their aims and their success in achieving those aims. And back to you,
Great.
Adam.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about our equity focus. As I tried to say earlier, the foundation believes and has always believed that all lives have equal value. And our U.S. education K-12 strategy is now very explicitly stating a funding focus on those students with the greatest need. And, you know, we put that out in the RFI, and you really helped us understand a little bit more how you were both thinking about and trying to execute along some similar lines. What was interesting to us is that while it was very clear that many of the intermediaries who responded to the RFI care deeply about these achievement gaps that are persistent and deep, very few actually had aims in their work that were specifically targeted at improving outcomes for Black, Latino, and low-income students. So again, there was sort of a bigger picture commitment and focus, but when it came to the specific aim of the work, there were few that were that targeted. And so for us, that means that in our RFP, and you'll see this language throughout, and you'll see questions that ask you to speak directly to this, that we're going to be looking to understand your clear and authentic commitment to equity. It's simply a requirement for this particular part of the strategy and for the possibility of funding. We are also particularly interested in hearing from intermediaries who have invested and are committed to developing a diverse leadership team and workforce. That is another piece of work that we're trying to push and understand more as we move forward. So I want to go back to, again, sort of the bigger picture for us. We hope that the intermediaries will use our funding to create teams engaged, and this builds on some of the things that Vivian said earlier, engaged in continuous improvement in the service of producing these equitable outcomes for students. Merely engaging in continuous improvement for school improvement's sake will not be sufficient for this particular investment opportunity. So it's the connectivity between the continuous improvement focus on equitable outcomes for these specific population of kids. For example, we want to see applicants examining traditional decision-making structures to address structural biases that can disadvantage Black, Latino, and or low-income students. We look forward to learning, for example, about how you may have dealt with or plan to deal with behavior and discipline systems that disproportionately remove Black boys from instruction as part of your plan to address ninth grade attendance problems within your network. Again, just giving that as an example. We're also interested in things that may help schools identify and address the over-allocation of students of color in special ed programs and or under-enrollment of the same students in advanced courses as part of a network to address college readiness outcomes. Again, another example, trying to show you how we are interested in this work showing up for real in a network. We think there are lots of opportunities for this in the networks and are looking forward to seeing what you put in front of us. I'm going to move on to the budget, which is our next slide. This one's a little bit funky. One of the things we asked you about in the RFI was, for those of you who are doing work in and around this space, how much does it cost? And these were some of the most interesting parts of the RFI to read. And as you can see there, we got a really big range from $1,000 to over $1 million around how some of you kind of put your budget together and how you allocated costs. You can see here what influenced costs. Mostly it had to do with the number of schools, the geographic spread, what was the actual work, and what was the kind of support that the intermediary was offering. I think it's fair to say that grant making is a combination of art and science. It is an interesting alchemy to do this well, and part of that alchemy for us was to think about the kind of cost range that we think is fair, reasonable, and can support the work that we're hoping folks will do. And so you'll see on this slide, and it's in the RFP, that based on the average network size of 20 to 40 schools, that we think that the grant ranges in $1 to $4 million a year is probably what these grants will look like. And you hear me hedging a little bit in my language, probably, maybe, because that's just our honest take on it. We don't know precisely how much this will cost, but we know we needed to give guidance to the field about what kind of grants are we talking about. And so here's your guidance. For those of you who are invited to submit full proposals, you will have an opportunity to work with the senior program officer to kind of work through these details. But we really do appreciate you all sharing the kind of background and budget information that helps us kind of come to these numbers on budget. So we're about to move on to the kind of Q&A section, and we're going to start by kind of reviewing some of the questions that we heard that came in over the transom earlier. But I want to do two things that I forgot to highlight earlier. So the RFI was kind of step one, was sort of this broad, kind of request for information from the field about this idea of supporting networks for school improvement. The written RFP is sort of step two, right? For those of you who decide to respond to the RFP. There are some other steps. So after we get back the responses from the RFP, we will be going through a process, and there's a slide on this later, but I think it's important to sort of set the context of deciding what responses we think warrant a follow-up interview, conversation, and site visit, and ultimately we will have a number of folks who we invite to submit proposals for funding. We anticipate and intend to issue an RFP annually. We don't think necessarily that we need to issue an RFI every time. So this is our first RFP. We expect and hope to, again, issue an RFP annually. So for those of you who think that it might not be a fit at this point in time based on your reading of the RFP and where your organization is, do know that there will be opportunities in the future. I promise you that the second RFP will look different than the first one. And the reason I can promise you that is because we ourselves believe in continuous improvement. And just like the RFI allowed us to write a better RFP, we know that the learnings from this RFP and the process of partnership this first round will lead us to a better second RFP, and if we're doing our jobs well, a better third RFP, et cetera. So we're going to move on to our questions. So let's see here. I'm asking you a question, right, Vivian?
You are asking me a question. But first, you're going to tell people that if you want to submit some questions, remember you can use the Q&A function on this webinar to submit some questions. We know we won't get to all of them today, but we're going to try to answer as many as we can. And we're going to add some to our frequently asked questions and get back to you within 48 hours.
Perfect. Right? Okay. Vivian, okay. I do have a question for you.
Hit it.
If an intermediary organization did not respond to the RFI, are they at a disadvantage in any way to the RFP process?
Thank you for that softball question, Adam. So there is a simple answer to this, and the answer is no. We are very grateful to everyone who sent us an RFI response, and I hope you heard in this webinar that those responses really did help us shape our RFP and some of our details and how we think about our networks for school improvement. At the same time, we knew we absolutely did not want to keep anyone from applying for funding just because they didn't have the time or resources to apply for, to respond to the RFI. So the RFP is totally open and not at all connected to the RFI. And one thing that we're doing to make sure that nobody is disadvantaged in our RFP process is that we're going to use a double-blind scoring mechanism where readers won't know during the initial screening who the applicant is or whether or not they responded to the RFI.
Only because it came up in a call I had with someone yesterday. They asked me, who's reading these RFPs and who are making the decisions? I'm going to ask and answer the question myself.
Do you want me to ask it?
Our team. So Vivian and I have the great pleasure and privilege of representing a team on the K-12 team who's responsible for leading and executing this part of this strategy, the Networks for School Improvement Strategy. And our team, as a collective, will be reading and reviewing the RFP responses and making decisions about who to move forward and how to move forward. So people ask, and that's who's going to be doing it. So just wanted to put that out there.
Okay, so time for me to ask you a question. This one came in from several potential applicants who are based outside of the United States. So, Adam, is the RFP open to foreign-based organizations, and if so, what are the restrictions?
So this one caught me off guard because it just, frankly, just never didn't expect it. Didn't expect that our little RFI went somewhere other than the United States. So the answer to this question is a little bit more complicated than the one about whether or not you're disadvantaged for not responding to the RFI. So let me start by saying, yes, we are open to funding organizations headquartered anywhere in the world. Anywhere in the world. But, and this, the but is important, but those organizations must have a sufficient footprint in the United States to operate a network for school improvement. And they've got to meet all of our eligibility requirements and criteria, which are outlined in the RFP. And they're on the web page, and you should really read them if you're a foreign-based intermediary. Keep in mind, though, that we are not going to fund a non-U.S. based intermediary to expand its work in the USA if you don't already have, if you can't already show that you can add value for Black, Latino, and low-income students in networks of secondary schools. And because we are a U.S. education program, we are not funding networks of schools, school improvement that includes schools that are outside of the U.S. So if your schools are based in another country, we wish you well, but this RFP specifically is not for you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you another question since you're so great at answering these questions and you make the big bucks. Okay, so help me clarify something you just said. I heard you say a couple times in this webinar, quote, and low-income students. Tell me more about that. So what is the exact definition? Black, Latino, and low-income students in terms of the network.
Yeah. So, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, because this is it's important. So, in our language on this has evolved a bit over time, and we're trying to be consistent and clear. So. But it looks like probably in some of that communications, it clearly hasn't landed clear enough for folks because we've gotten this question in a few different forms. And so I'm going to try and give a bit of a clearer response here. Our commitment to equity means that we will consider supporting networks for school improvement where the majority of students in the network as a whole are Black, Latino, and or low income. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Our commitment to equity means that we will consider supporting networks for school improvement where the majority of students in the network as a whole are Black, Latino, and or low income. Not every school has to have the same population, but the overall network must serve a majority of students who fit that description. Again, we refer to the data, we refer to kind of the persistent and deep gaps in this country. So just to be really clear, students who are from low-income families but are not Black or Latino are intentionally included in this definition because we know that there is a very real income-based achievement gap in the United States in addition to the racial achievement gap.
Okay, thank you. That is a very helpful clarification. A few more questions that we had come in over the last couple of days, and then we're going to open it up to see what questions have come in during this webinar. And just a quick reminder to everybody that if you want to IM a question to Adam or me, go ahead and use the Q&A function instead of the chat bar. So, Adam, I'm going to ask you another question. This is a harder one. Okay. Get ready.
Yeah.
Can you clarify the difference between Type 1 grants and Type 2 grants And why doesn't the RFP ask applicants to apply for one or the other?
Okay. We worked hard on the RFP, as you well know, Vivian. So we think there's a pretty good section on this in the grant-making eligibility guidelines. So again, I just want to refer folks to those documents because we spent a fair amount of time trying to be as clear as we could, but we also think the voiceover is important. But the upshot here is that we will work with grantees to identify if they are ready to do this work in a full-blown network, moving student outcomes within 5 years, which is basically what we're calling a Type 1 grant. We'll also work with folks to figure out whether or not they need a little bit more practice or support before they can come back and apply for one of those Type 1 grants. Folks who are in that latter category are eligible for what we're calling those Type 2 grants. Vivian, you may remember that I wanted to call the Type 2 grants practicum grants because they were about practice and some capacity building, but because I was overruled, we're not calling them practicum grants, we're calling them Type 2. But for those of you who like language, practicum might be helpful to you. Back into your point about asking intermediaries to self-select. We thought long and hard about asking intermediaries to do that and to specify whether or not they wanted to be considered for a Type 1 or a Type 2 grant up front in their RFP application. And then we decided that the distinction might not be clear enough or easy enough for folks to make, and that in fact, we could ask a really strong set of RFP questions that would help us understand their intentions and their capacity, and that we could use the latter stages of the RFP process to work with those intermediaries to figure out whether or not a Type 1 or a Type 2 grant is more appropriate. So that's kind of how we're thinking about it. That's why we didn't say select one now.
And this is, I would add, to where the art of grant making comes in.
Yeah.
So there may be, based on the intermediary, based on the problem that they're trying to solve or the aim that they have, a reason that they may be put in a Type 1 or a Type 2. I will stress, though, that we did find through the RFI responses that lots of intermediaries are really interested in building their capacity in areas. So once again, I don't want people to think that if you don't have all of the criteria that you see in the RFP, that you should shy away from responding to the RFP.
I'll say one more thing, because you're making me think more. So the other thing I'll say about Type 1 versus Type 2 is, and perhaps this is obvious, but I want to say it, is that frankly the bar for a Type 1 grant is significantly higher than a Type 2 grant.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is the capacity, that big broad word of an intermediary is going to have to be deeper and wider, whether it's data, facility with data, data infrastructure, relationships with districts.
Expertise around the problem to be solved and changes to tests to make some progress towards that aim.
Yeah. And so, again, we're not asking folks to self-select. We want folks to answer and respond to the RFP questions that are in the document. But for those folks who move further through the process, we'll be working with you to figure out what feels about right. And this, again, I talked earlier about, we expect the second RFP to be better than the first one. I'd say this is one of those particular areas, to Vivian's point about art versus science, that we think will be a little bit messy, but we're actually comfortable with that messiness, right? That's part of the engagement that we'll have with folks who are moving forward. One more question for you, Vivian.
All right.
Before we go to the Q&A chat bar. Approximately how many schools are expected to participate in a network, and when do intermediaries need to be able to say which schools are going to participate?
Okay, so, obviously we prefer that we reach the most number of students possible. We really want to improve outcomes for Black, Latino, and low-income students. So we're looking for networks ideally between 20 and 40 schools, but the absolute minimum number of schools is 10 schools per network. And we do think that there's a relationship among the problem that you're trying to solve and the number of schools that are in the network and the evidence base behind solving those problems. To answer your question about when you need to identify the schools, since the RFP is only open for 6 weeks, many intermediaries may not be able or may not even want to find schools in that amount of time. We talk a little bit about this in the frequently asked questions on that website. So if you're in that position, your proposed network for school improvement should allocate some planning time and an appropriate budget for you to assemble a coherent network of schools that are committed during the life of the grant. So in some cases, gathering those schools may only take a few weeks. In other cases, it may take up to a year. And we really encourage you now to think carefully about how you'll find the right schools and what diligence and what data analysis and what you'll need to do to ensure that you pick the right mix of schools for the type of network you have in mind. If you end up being invited, as Adam said, like this is part of a process and responding to the RFP is one part of the process. If you end up being invited to an interview, we'll want to talk in more detail about your plan to find schools. And ultimately, if you end up receiving a grant and you still don't have schools on board at that point, one of the milestones or conditions for ongoing funding will be evidence that you have assembled a coherent network of schools before we release more funds. So it's really, really important as part of the startup of your network to think carefully and deeply about how you'll find great schools. And just related, I'm just going to answer one more related question to that I have heard from people is it preferable that schools come from one district or CMO or that they come from multiple? And so we don't really have a preference on that. As an intermediary, you are totally free to propose the right partner schools that work for your network. So if you're planning to work with schools that are all part of one CMO or school district, that's fine. And if you want to facilitate a network of schools from different places, maybe different towns or districts or even states in a more virtual model, then your model should be built around that. And obviously the schools won't come from all the same district. It's totally up to you, and it really depends on your vision for the network and how you plan to connect schools together in a way that fits that vision. I think that there are pros and cons to each approach, as well as potential for really excellent work in both approaches.
So I'm going to get us started on some of the questions that are coming in through the Q&A bar, and I'm going to ask and answer the first one, which I think is a pretty straightforward one. Is having we're going to do these in a sort of an order that sort of makes sense in our heads, except we're figuring it out in real time. Is having an external evaluator a requirement of the grant? The answer is no. And I'm going to say more about that. So you do not have to bake in or include an evaluation in your response. Learning is very important to us and to you. We know that. That came through the RFI process. The foundation will be sponsoring a formative and a summative evaluation of this work and this strategy. And so one of the requirements will be that intermediaries who are funded participate in those evaluations, again, a formative evaluation and a summative evaluation. We are wholly committed, you know better than we do, that formative evaluation has to be meaningful. It has to happen in real time, and it has to be co-constructed. And so while we know that we are going to move in that direction, we also know that we need to work in partnership with the folks we fund to build meaningful evaluations for you and for us in the field more broadly. So no, you do not need to build in an evaluator into your grant. Yes, you will have to participate in an evaluation sponsored by the foundation. More details on that are coming.
All right, I'm next, and I have two really great questions. I'm going to answer this one first. Okay, to what extent does the intermediary recruit schools that share an interest in a problem or practice versus identifying schools for the network who then identify a problem or practice they want to work on together? So I think it goes back to the last question, that I think that there isn't one right way to bring together a network. So we have seen networks come together where an intermediary identifies a problem, a practice that is sort of pervasive across a country or across a district or something like that, and then recruits schools to work on it. And then we have seen others where they assemble a group of schools together, and then they try to decide whether there's something in common that they want to work on together. Both of those are rooted in data and evidence when you come up with that problem. And again, I think that there are pros and cons to it. I think the most critical things to think about are, is there data that says that that is a meaningful problem for those schools? And do the schools find it a really relevant problem that they want to work on, that they have the sort of commitment, ambition, the will to work on together?
All right, I'm going to try this one. Is facilitating a network for school improvement different from providing technical assistance to a network for school improvement? What are the key differences? What would disqualify an organization from being able to apply in that regard? This is a little bit tricky. It is a good question. So it really depends on, frankly, how you're defining technical assistance provider. I'm going to make a guess at how you're defining it, but understanding what you mean by that would help us answer this question better. So I'm going to give you a sense of how I think about it. I think of a technical assistance provider as someone who has a solution, interim assessments, for example, as a way to seek change or promote change at a system, a school, a student level. The reason I think that is, how that is different than facilitating an NSI, is that an NSI, in doing its continuous improvement work, its root cause analysis with schools, don't necessarily know what solutions are going to actually move the needle and what the actual problem or outcome or indicator that they need to be working on. And so that's one way, I think, to think about this difference. If you are a hammer searching for a nail, that's a great thing and there's need for that work, but that doesn't actually, I don't think that's a real fit with how we're thinking about our networks for school improvement. We also think that, I'm going to go back to what we said earlier about the power of the school network, and it's really about understanding the need of the schools as a network and identifying what solutions would move forward. And so we absolutely think that there could be some technical assistance providers who could move into this intermediary space. We don't think being a technical assistance provider precludes you from applying, but we want you to think deeply about whether or not you're a hammer searching for a nail. If you are, it's probably not for you, but we'll let you make that decision. How does that sound? Would you have answered that question?
No, I would have answered the question similarly. And in fact, we'll get more into it into the next question too, because it kind of relates to that.
My question or your question?
No, it's my question.
Okay.
All right. All right. So this question is, does this project require that the promising solutions used to address the root causes of the problem of practice be developed by the schools in the network, or can they also include practices and strategies that we as an intermediary bring to the table? So that's pretty similar to the question that Adam had. So, part of our definition, or I should say this, a critical part of our definition is that the schools in the network do a root cause analysis of that problem of practice. And so they don't just like grab a solution right away because it seems to be the thing to address that problem. They really look at data to understand what the problem is. On the other hand, I'll say this, we do know some things that do work in education. One of the things is that some of the things that we know that work in education to solve problems don't work reliably and consistently in all contexts. So because you have a point of view on something doesn't preclude you from being an intermediary for an NSI, but we would want to see and maintain, in keeping with the definition of continuous improvement and improvement science, is that the solution actually addresses the root causes that those schools have. And one last point on this is that, you know, when you think about a problem also often has multiple root causes. So, you know, you can think about a school where, you know, there is low English proficiency. But when you look at the data, you might find that one of the causes of that low English proficiency is writing proficiency. But you might also find that there's a big attendance problem and students aren't coming to school, or that students, Black and Latino students, are moved out of school classrooms more often. So you would want to attack that problem, the root causes of that problem, and it may mean things that are beyond the solutions that an intermediary has. Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that covered it.
Okay.
Great. So we're going to begin to wind down, and we're going to probably reinforce a few things that that you heard earlier, but we think they are good to reinforce. So first and foremost, we just want to thank folks for, again, responding to the RFI and joining this webinar. As we said before, the RFP application, this written application, is really the first part of a multi-stage process, which begins when you submit an application and ends when a successful applicant works with a program officer to get a final proposal for funding approved and signed off on in August 2018. We know, that August of 2018 seems like a long time. So we're going to make a few commitments to you so that you can plan ahead a little bit more clearly for your work. Our first commitment is to make sure that when you submit your application, we will instantly acknowledge receipt of your application so you know that it's safely in our hands. We know from the RFI work that folks are taking this work incredibly seriously and thoughtfully. And as I said early, we really want to come to this with humility and respect. And so we want to hopefully have you feel that through the process. So know that we will acknowledge receipt of your application as soon as we get it. We will encourage you, however, to make sure you keep a local copy of your application. There's a downloadable Word document that you can use to work offline on your application, and we encourage you to use that to keep that just as your local copy of the application. Knock on wood, the platform worked really well for the RFI responses, and we're going to be using the same one for the RFP, so we don't expect or anticipate any problems, but you never know. So keep that local copy. Second, every applicant should know by the end of March whether we are advancing their application to the next stage. So again, by the end of March, you will know whether or not we are advancing your application to the next stage of the selection process, which would be a video interview. There is a slight chance, however, that we might need to change or alter this timeline if we get totally inundated with more applications than we can give due consideration to. We might need to have or come up with a plan B that just has a modified timeline. If that happens, we will email every applicant on or around March 16th to let you know when you will hear from us. We hope, and we're going to do our best to stick to the timeline that we've outlined, but because we don't know and this is new to us, we do need to give us the space to make sure that we're doing this work responsibly. For now, we're going to stick with Plan A, which means that you all hear from us by the end of March if you submit an application. If you are invited to an interview and then pass the next stage, we will conduct a site visit with you. Don't ask us what we're going to do in those site visits because we don't yet know. But after that, successful applicants will be invited, as we said earlier, to create a formal grant proposal with a program officer. And the detailed grant development work will include creating a final budget, a measurement plan. We'll build in all the milestones and all that, the good stuff of concrete grant making. But sort of that's what the next steps look like. A couple other things to highlight, right? We want to make sure folks are reminded that a more detailed RFI takeaway memo will be available next week. You might remember we highlighted some things around continuous improvement, networks, aims, the budget, and equity. More detail on those learnings from the RFI in the takeaway memo from next week. There will be another webinar next Friday. So we will take questions that come in between now and then and use this forum to talk folks through them. We will also do a deeper briefing around our goals, aspirations, and plans around the measurement, learning, and evaluation aspects of this strategy and this grant making. So for those of you who have read, or when you do read the RFP, you will see a fair amount about data and measurement, outcomes, indicators, and we think it'll be valuable for us to kind of just to use a webinar format to talk you through some of our thinking on those things too. So if that's of interest to you, we encourage you to register and to participate in next week's webinar.
And that's it.
I think that's it.
I think that's it.
So
thank you, everybody. And we will hopefully see you next week. Talk to you next week.
Talk to you next week. Thanks, everybody.